Describe the scariest moment of your life. I was ice skating on what I thought was a safely frozen lake when, without warning, the ice gave way. I plunged into the frigid water, sinking until it was roughly nipples deep. Then, unbelievably, my skates hit solid ground, a sandbar perfectly situated right beneath me in the middle of the lake. A mere 2 inches in either direction, and I would have dropped straight to the bottom. Just as panic started to set in, a guy from my high school, someone I knew only from the bus, appeared with a hockey stick. He extended it to me, and with considerable risk and bravery on his part. He was a big guy, and the ice around the hole was dangerously thin. He managed to pull me out of the icy water. He'd been the target of some light teasing in high school, but that pretty much stopped after I spent the next day telling half the school how he'd saved my life. A few months later, I overheard someone bad-mouthing him. Without hesitation, I jumped in saying, "He saved my life one afternoon." WTF have you ever done? When I was 17, my girlfriend and I were sitting on top of the local headlands. She got to take a photo near the edge and suddenly tripped. Watching her vanish over the side and then hearing the sickening thump as she hit the ground below is a memory that still chills me. I sprinted to the nearest house, got them to call for an ambulance, and then scrambled down to where she had fallen. She was unconscious and had a deep, massive gash just above her hip, but thankfully, she was still breathing. Eventually, a helicopter airlifted her to the hospital. The next 3 weeks were incredibly tense, with her condition fluctuating, but she eventually made a significant recovery, albeit with the loss of a kidney and spleen and the need for artificial joints. Miraculously, she sustained no brain or spinal damage. I've faced some genuinely scary situations in my life, but the time between seeing her disappear over that edge and reaching her body, not knowing if she was dead, dying, or if I would even be able to help her when I got there, was without a doubt the most terrifying period I've ever endured. About a year ago, I was at our neighborhood park with my 3 young kids, a 4-year-old, a 2.5-year-old, and a 1-year-old. It's a really nice park with new equipment, plenty of shade, and it's always well kept and full of young families. It's almost picture perfect, like something out of a movie, except for one glaring flaw. It's not entirely enclosed by a fence. This is a real concern because a fairly busy street runs right alongside it. And what makes it even worse is that it's a one-way street that serves as an off-ramp from a highway, as well as connecting to 2 other major roads. Often, there's a brief lull in traffic followed by a surge of 15 to 20 cars speeding down it at around 35 to 45 miles per hour. I was in the middle of the park, helping my youngest daughter with something, while periodically scanning to check on my 4-year-old son and my 2.5-year-old daughter, Izzy, making sure they were both safely within the park boundaries. I think my eyes were off Izzy for maybe 10 seconds, and when I looked up, she was sprinting at full tilt directly towards the street. Now, I'm a fit, athletic guy, so normally I would have been able to reach her in time. But she was running so incredibly fast and had covered so much ground while my attention was elsewhere that even as I took off after her in a full sprint, I knew with sickening certainty that I wouldn't be able to stop her before she reached the road. As I ran, I was screaming her name, yelling for her to stop, but being a typical 2.5-year-old, she was completely oblivious to my frantic cries. Pure terror washed over me, and I felt lightheaded, knowing what was about to happen. Despite my desperate sprint, my frantic shouts, and my mental pleas for her to stop, she didn't slow down and ran right into the middle of the street. My heart stopped in my chest. Time seemed to freeze. My gut clenched and all the blood drained from my body. I couldn't hear anything. All I could see were her innocent blue eyes as she stood in the middle of the road, smiling back at me. In that moment, everything ended. My life had ended, but it hadn't. I reached her maybe 3 seconds after she stopped running and snatched her up off the ground at full speed, not even registering whether any cars were coming. Unbelievably, she had run into the street during a rare gap in the traffic. Was it sheer luck? Had I just experienced some kind of waking nightmare or hallucination? For a disoriented moment afterwards, I wondered if she had actually been hit and if my mind was trying to rewrite the past with a different outcome. But no, this time, Izzy had somehow escaped the jaws of death and was alive and safe in my arms. That was, without a doubt, the scariest and worst moment of my life, and I honestly can't imagine anything ever being more terrifying. The first time that feeling of utter dread washed over me was when the doctor delivered the news that my best friend of 18 years wasn't going to survive. The second time was completely different, a sudden, visceral confrontation with my own mortality. I was driving home from school, a long hour-and-a-half commute each way, on top of an 8-hour school day. Sleep was often a luxury. On this particular afternoon, something in the car, something other than the road ahead, momentarily caught my attention. Honestly, I think I might have drifted off for a split second. When my focus snapped back, there were massive concrete barriers looming directly in front of me. The highway was under construction. My speedometer read 70 miles per hour. Panic seized me. I slammed on the brakes, instinctively checked my mirrors to make sure the lane beside me was clear, and then swerved sharply to the left, desperately trying to avoid the collision. The car lurched, and I lost control. All I could think in that terrifying instant was, oh my God, this isn't a dream. I'm really going to die. This was all happening on an overpass, adding another layer of fear. I fought to regain control, but the car careened into the concrete wall of the overpass with a violent impact. The entire front end of my car crumpled, the airbag exploded, and I remember a searing sensation, like inhaling fire. I scrambled out of the wreckage as fast as I could, stumbled to the other side of the overpass, curled into a fetal position, and just sobbed uncontrollably. What shocked me most in the immediate aftermath was how many cars simply drove past me, as if nothing had occurred. A few agonizing minutes later, a woman ran towards me, wrapped her arms around me in a tight embrace, and held me until the paramedics arrived. During my freshman year of college, feeling utterly adrift and alone without a support system, I found myself in a dark place. One night, around 3 a.m., I was sitting by myself in the basement of the dorms. Looking back, I know that retreating to a sensory-deprived basement while feeling that isolated wasn't the smartest move, but my thoughts weren't exactly rational. Depression can trap you in a cycle of self-loathing and withdrawal. So there I was, depressed, overwhelmed by the silence and dimness, and physically drained from crying and self-destructive outbursts. Finally, I decided it was time to try and sleep. I jabbed the elevator button, and when the doors opened, the elevator car was empty. But then something got off it. I stared at this entity, this thing. A horrifying realization dawned on me. This was my evil self, the physical manifestation of my self-hatred, given form, purpose, and a will to destroy me. Panic surged, and I bolted for the stairs, screaming as I ran. I burst onto the ground floor, past the bewildered security guard before he could react, and out into the parking lot. It had followed me. I screamed at it, focusing all my mental energy, forcing it down into the asphalt, convinced that somehow I could trap it there. I managed to hold it at bay long enough to partially calm down and walk back into the dorm. Surprisingly, security didn't even ask for my ID. No one wanted to mess with the clearly unhinged guy. I reached my room, but standing at the door, a chilling certainty washed over me. It was inside. Going in there, I felt, would lead to self-destruction. I tried to go back downstairs to find anyone, but I felt that same oppressive presence at every stairwell and elevator. I was cut off from my friends, or rather, the friends I didn't really feel I had, which was the root of the problem in the first place. So, I ended up sitting in the hallway, rocking back and forth and muttering to myself until my resident advisor finally appeared. Even though I've never touched drugs, that night I experienced firsthand what a truly terrifying bad trip must feel like. I know it was a hallucination, my own mind playing the cruelest of tricks, but it remains the single most frightening moment of my life. One night, when I was a kid, I was sleeping over at my friend's house while her parents were away on a cruise. I woke up to strange noises. Their house had 3 floors and incredibly creaky stairs. I could hear sounds coming from both floors below us, the distinct sounds of cupboards being opened and then closed, one after the other, throughout the house. I lay there, frozen with fear, listening as they methodically seemed to search every room, the creaking of the stairs growing louder as they made their way up to our floor. I was too terrified to open my eyes at first, but when I finally did, I saw a light coming from the hallway. I was certain I had turned that light off before we went to sleep. I kept my eyes tightly shut as they reached the 3rd floor where we were sleeping. One set of footsteps continued down the hall toward my friend's parents' room at the other end. The other person silently pushed our bedroom door open. It had only been slightly ajar before. I pretended to be asleep, convinced that if he noticed I was awake, he would hurt me. He stood in the doorway, just breathing for what felt like an eternity, at least 2 long minutes. I could clearly hear his breathing, and I could feel his gaze on me. Eventually, he left and quietly closed the door behind him. Even after I couldn't hear them anymore, I was too scared to move, paralyzed with fear until I finally drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I told my friend everything that had happened, but because nothing had been stolen, neither she nor her parents believed me. There were 2 things to consider. Firstly, at that time, there had been several break-ins in the neighborhood by drug addicts looking for quick cash. Secondly, everyone in town knew where my friend's parents kept their spare key. Her parents had money, but they were notoriously frugal and didn't keep any obvious valuables in the house. No jewelry, nothing of significant worth. In that context, I'm not surprised nothing was taken. The anxieties of early adulthood took on a sharp new edge in 2002. We had a new baby boy, a new marriage, a whole new life unfolding in the hills of West Virginia. We were poor but happy, embracing our little family in the aftermath of 9/11. One evening, my wife and I were making a big pot of our really good chili. Our 1-year-old son, naturally curious, decided he wanted to help, which, of course, wasn't a safe activity for a baby. This resulted in me gently lifting him away from the stove several times, holding him under his arms and redirecting him out of the kitchen. Finally, the chili was ready, steaming and bubbling. Dinner was being served. I had my hands on the soup bowls, and my wife was pouring sweet tea. Neither of us could have reacted quickly enough to prevent our 1-year-old from reaching up and pulling the entire 2-gallon pot of boiling chili down onto himself. Instinctively, I managed to deflect the falling container just enough that it narrowly missed his face and upper body. However, a significant amount, at least a liter, soaked his left arm all the way up to his shoulder. As I scooped him up, perhaps too roughly in my panic, I could literally feel the first few layers of skin on his arm just immediately start to peel off and stick to my hand. We dropped everything, rushed him to the shower, and stood him under the cool water for a few agonizing minutes. Seeing his arm continue to blister and peel, we made the split-second decision that driving him to the hospital ourselves would be faster than waiting for an ambulance. So that's what we did, speeding down those winding country roads with our hazard lights flashing, completely disregarding any traffic laws or potential consequences in our desperate urgency. Thankfully, he is completely fine now. He even has a small, faded scar on his arm, a tiny reminder of that terrifying night. But in that moment when it happened, it was utterly breathtaking. And I'm old enough and wise enough to understand what could have happened if that scalding chili had hit him full force on his chest or face. So, even when difficult things happen, you have to find a way to be grateful, because those bad situations could always be so much worse. A few years back, my best friend and I were both competitive 600 cubic centimeters motorcycle road racers. One day, during a practice session at our local circuit, he didn't return to the pit lane after his time on the track. I was busy working on my own bike while he was out riding, so I didn't immediately notice. After a while, though, when he still hadn't come back, I went to look for him, figuring his bike had probably broken down somewhere on the track. As I walked toward the track marshal's office, a recovery truck drove past, and in the back, I saw the mangled remains of his motorcycle. It was completely wrecked. I immediately asked the marshal what had happened to the rider. He told me that my friend had been attended to by the medics and taken to the local hospital, adding that the crash had looked pretty bad. I've known my best friend's family since we were kids, and I was the one who initially got him into riding motorcycles. In that agonizing hour it took me to get to the hospital and finally find him, my mind was consumed by one terrifying thought. What would I say to his mother if the worst had happened? As it turned out, he had only suffered a concussion and a broken ankle. But that single hour, filled with unimaginable dread and uncertainty, was far more terrifying than any of the times I had crashed a bike myself. With a friend, I'd recently bought a 1991 Honda CBR F1 600 cubic centimeters sport motorcycle. We took turns keeping it. One night, around midnight, in the thrill of being 21, I went for a late-night joyride, pushing the speed on some winding freeway and local roads in the mountains. Cruising at around 65 miles per hour, I suddenly realized I wouldn't make the upcoming curve. Despite leaning hard to the left, I knew I was going to overshoot it. I hit the curb, and both the bike and I went flying. It's true what they say, when you think you might die, everything slows down. I glanced at the speedometer and saw it hovering around 60 miles per hour. The next thing I knew, my motorcycle was sideways underneath me, and I was lying on top of it, my backside on the seat, my helmet and shoulders scraping against the asphalt as we skidded down what felt like a quarter-mile of freeway, like a human toboggan. My shoulders and helmet bore the brunt of the impact, with the side of the motorcycle taking the rest. I finally came to a stop, and my first petty thought was, damn, my favorite shirt is ruined. Then I noticed blood trickling down my neck and my arms dripping red. But all my fingers and toes were there, and miraculously, nothing felt broken. I looked back at the quarter-mile stretch of highway littered with broken motorcycle parts in the silent, dark mountains. I immediately dropped to my knees and kissed the ground, weeping uncontrollably as I thanked God. A guy in a pickup truck stopped and helped me. About an hour later, bruised and shaken, I was back at my dorm. On a sudden impulse, I trekked up the mountainside to where a girl I loved deeply, but with whom I was just friends, was staying. My shirt was ripped, dried blood stained my arms and ears, and my shoes had holes. I knocked on her door and blurted out that I'd crashed my motorcycle, almost died, and that I had to tell her I loved her deeply. I explained that I had to do what I needed to do because I'd almost died without ever truly loving someone. We shared the most amazing kiss, my very first, a slightly clumsy one where we even bumped teeth. We then hid under the stairwell near the laundry area and continued kissing for almost half an hour. That night changed my life. She changed my life. The motorcycle crash changed my life. I vowed never to ride again, convinced that a God I hadn't truly believed in had literally saved me, a miracle by my own definition. She's married now, which I sometimes regret, but I've never regretted our years together, which remain the most beautiful of my life. When I was around 4 years old, I was walking down the street with my dad. Out of nowhere, a man walked past and kicked me. The force of the kick sent me tumbling, and I slipped and fell into an open sewer drain. I don't think I went all the way down, thankfully. I've been told that my dad, who was really into judo at the time, didn't let that guy get away with it and gave him a good beating. In North Korea, while our UN food aid ship was preparing to leave port, we were violently assaulted and the ship was being looted. We were actively fighting to raise the gangway and keep people off the vessel. During this chaotic and dangerous situation, a few men came directly after me and my belongings. To defend myself, I ended up in a fight with one of them, which resulted in his death. I still carry the weight of that event, but I know it was a matter of survival, either him or me. Other members of our crew sustained very serious injuries and had to be airlifted to Seoul for medical attention once we were out to sea and past the exclusion zone. It was my senior year of high school, and to have some spending money while keeping my weekdays relatively free for school, I worked Sundays and Mondays at a Jewish bakery. We sold all sorts of delicious things: cakes, breads, and a huge variety of cookies. On December 18th, 2006, a man walked in and inquired about job openings. Not being entirely sure about our current hiring situation, I went to find my manager to ask her about the process. She gave me the standard line: get his information and we'll keep it on file. So I headed back upstairs with a pen and paper. He said he'd jot down his details in his car and be right back in. It was only about 5 minutes before 7 p.m. closing time on a slow Monday, so I honestly didn't expect to see him again. No big deal. But to my surprise, the man reappeared just as we were getting ready to lock up. I was pretty much in go-home mode, standing behind the register and waiting for the minute hand to hit 12. As the man handed me the paper with his hastily written information, he asked me a chilling question. Do you want to live to see Christmas? I stammered, "What dash?" In that instant, he pulled a gun from his right pocket. It's an indescribable feeling when a gun is drawn on you, but I vividly remember the sensation of blood rushing from my feet all the way up to my head, or maybe it was the other way around. Either way, it was an overwhelming physical reaction. After pulling the gun, he made a half-hearted attempt to pull a bandana over his nose and mouth, despite the fact that several security cameras and 2 employees had already clearly seen his face. He also had very distinctive features that would have made him easy to identify. The whites of his eyes were yellow, and he was missing his front right tooth. The man ordered me to take him to the safe, which we didn't have. However, I knew there was a significant amount of cash downstairs, so I started walking toward the kitchen, with him following closely behind me. My hand weren't raised or anything, but I remember pleading with him, saying something like, "Please don't shoot anybody." He assured me that no one would get hurt if everyone just did what he said. He followed me down a flight of stairs and into our long hallway, which led towards the office where my manager and her boyfriend were balancing the registers for the night. My manager was just coming out of the bathroom as we approached the office, and she definitely caught sight of his gun because she let out a scream and ran into the office, sort of barricading herself inside the small room with her boyfriend. My immediate thought was that I was in serious trouble. But no, the thief kicked the office door open and started yelling. As the door swung inward, I saw my manager holding the phone, halfway through dialing 911. The robber snatched the phone out of her hand and threw it forcefully to the ground, where it shattered into pieces. It was surreal. He ordered everyone to get on the ground, demanding all the money from the safe. My manager reiterated that we didn't have a safe. That was clearly the last thing he wanted to hear, so I chimed in, reminding her that there was a lot of cash in the filing cabinet behind her. I don't think I was supposed to know about it, but in that moment, it seemed like the best course of action. She put the money, around $700 from what I recall her saying, into a manila envelope. He then told me he wanted me to escort him back upstairs. At that point, I honestly thought I was going to die. As we walked back up that long hallway, with each step, I pictured the potential crime scene. Evidence photos with an 18-year-old dead, sprawled out in a pool of blood, a gunshot wound to the back of the head. Not a pleasant image. We reached the top of the stairs, and I braced myself, thinking it was all going to be over any second. I didn't know how it would end, but I definitely wanted to make it home later that night. As we passed the back exit through the kitchen, I suggested he leave through the back alley. That way no one would see him. He didn't seem to like the idea, but didn't argue. Instead, he left the store through the front entrance, the same way he had come in. Before leaving, he warned me not to call the cops and told me to go back to the office and stay there. I went back downstairs to the office, where my manager was already on the phone with the police. I watched the guy walk out the front door on the security camera feed upstairs. As soon as he was gone, I ran out the back exit from the kitchen and into the store next door. The whole thing was incredibly messed up, and I ended up spending about 30 to 45 minutes talking to the police after it was all over. I did, thankfully, get to go home later that night, And I remember recounting the story to my friends while we were playing Gears of War, killing locusts. The robber was eventually sentenced to 12 years and 1 day in prison, but not just for robbing our bakery. He had committed around 16 robberies in the area, so he was already a wanted man when he targeted the place I worked. On a side note, I'm a skinny white guy who wouldn't hurt a fly, and the whole experience really shook me up for a while. I saw a therapist for a month or two, but I eventually stopped going because I couldn't stand the awkward silences during our sessions. Also, he had this calendar with photos of naked African tribe members posing, which for some reason made me laugh every time I saw it. Please also keep in mind that I'm not a writer, so there are probably a lot of things I didn't explain perfectly in this story. I just figure it was better to share it in some form rather than not at all. When I was around 8 years old, I had a friend from school who came from a really difficult home life. He was Mexican, and whenever I noticed what looked like burn marks on his skin, he'd brush it off with some vague explanation about maybe something happened while he was sleeping. His father wasn't around, and his mother seemed to be constantly asleep or caught up in smoking and drinking. One day, while I was at his house, we decided to walk to a playground a few blocks away, mostly to get away from her. As we were walking, his mother drove by slowly, rolled down her window, and unleashed this terrifying scream at him for not telling her where we were going. The sheer intensity of it was beyond words. I was genuinely scared for him. I felt this overwhelming urge to do something, call the police, try to talk to her, but I was just a kid. She made us walk back home, and I did nothing. I'm pretty sure that was the last time we ever hung out. I often wonder where he is now. To get to my girlfriend's place after taking the train, I had to cross the tracks of a small, rural train station. The pedestrian bridge was a fair distance away, maybe 100 meters, so I got into the habit of quickly checking left and right and then just crossing over the tracks where I wasn't supposed to. One night, though, I had this sudden, strong feeling that something was off. I looked to my left, and there was a high-speed train I see was bearing down on me. At the same moment, I registered the intense hum of the tracks, far louder than usual. I sprinted, leaped across the last rail, and not even a second later, the train roared past, the force of its passing wake almost pulling me in. I was shaking uncontrollably for hours afterward, the adrenaline shock coursing through me. But even after that near-death experience, I still never bothered to use the pedestrian bridge. 14 months ago, I received a phone call. The one that told me my sister was gone. She was just 24, a medical student living and studying in Holland. While riding her bike, she was struck and killed by a car. It was the worst thing that has ever happened to me, the kind of pain that changes you forever. But that initial phone call, the moment I heard the words, that was the single scariest moment of my life. The nurse at the free clinic was going over my STI test results, and she gave me the all clear for everything except the HIV test. For those results, she said I need to schedule an appointment and come back to the clinic in person. In that split second before I registered that this was probably standard procedure for HIV results, regardless of the outcome, a wave of pure dread washed over me, and I swear my testicles completely retracted. To this day, I'm not sure if I was more terrified of actually having HIV or of testing positive for it before I had any health insurance. Thankfully, it turned out to be negative for me. I was driving my girlfriend's car one night, taking her home after about 3 months of dating. Out of nowhere, she seemed really anxious and blurted out, "Babe, let's go to the beach or something." It was 1 a.m. I could tell something was wrong, so asked her what was going on. She wouldn't tell me, just kept repeating that we needed to turn around and go to the beach. Sensing the urgency in her voice, I made a U-turn and drove away from her place, pressing her gently to tell me what was happening. She remained evasive, but was clearly very nervous. A few seconds later, a car pulled up close behind us, tailgating me aggressively. Completely failing to connect her odd request, her sudden change in demeanor, and the tailgater, I pulled over to let the car pass. He pulled over as well, right behind us. My girlfriend started to get hysterical. I floored the gas pedal and sped out onto a larger street. The car behind us began to pursue us relentlessly, slamming its front end into my rear quarter panel at what felt like 45 to 50 miles per hour. All the while, my girlfriend was screaming in terror. Having done some autocrossing in the past, I managed to maintain control of the car, but it was underpowered and heavy, making escape feel impossible. He hit us again, even harder this time. I barely managed to keep the car from spinning out completely, so I slowed down drastically, pretending I was going to pull over, though I had no intention of doing so. She started screaming at me to drive, to not let him out of his car. So I drove onto a main street, and in a stroke of unbelievable luck, a police car drove by. That was a rare sight in the city I was living in. We all got out of our respective cars. I was absolutely furious. The cop looked utterly confused, and the guy who had been chasing us was oddly calm. My girlfriend began to beg us to let him go. The cop turned to me, the technical victim, and asked what I wanted to do. In my mind, I'd pieced together that this had to be an ex-boyfriend or maybe a current side boyfriend, and his demeanor, along with her desperate plea, suggested possible gang affiliations. Not wanting to provoke unknown and potentially dangerous people, I reluctantly said, "Okay, let him go." It wasn't until later that I found out he had a gun in his car. I'd already decided to end the relationship after that terrifying night and wasn't surprised by her subsequent silence. Until one day, I received a frantic phone call. Her voice was hushed and urgent. "I'm in Oregon. I need help. He kidnapped me, and he's threatening to kill me." I immediately called the police, her family, and then hopped on my motorcycle and rode to Oregon. I live near San Francisco. He was eventually arrested and sentenced. But I still worry about what will happen when he gets out. I'm not exactly hard to find. When I was around 14 or 15, a friend of mine, in a moment of utter stupidity, decided to put a zip tie around my neck. It wasn't pulled tight at first, so I just remember thinking, what the heck, man? Anyway, we started looking around the garage for something to cut it off. We spotted an old paper cutter and, for some reason, thought that would do the job. So I lay my head down next to it, positioning the zip tie where the blade would come down. He brought the blade down, but of course the zip tie was thick plastic, so instead of cutting, it just pulled it incredibly tight. Suddenly, that thing was squeezing my windpipe. Panic flared as I desperately scanned the garage for a knife. I finally spotted a small blade on a workbench and managed to wedge it under the zip tie to cut it loose. That had to be the scariest 30 seconds of my life. I honestly don't even know if I've spoken to that friend since. When I was around 10 years old, my family and I went to the swimming pool at the local park. My cousin, who who was about 10 years older than me and significantly bigger, came with us. He had a brain injury that affected his understanding. While we were in the pool, he suddenly decided it would be fun to climb on top of me and hold me under the water. I have no idea how long I was submerged. It probably wasn't even 30 seconds, but in that moment, struggling to breathe, I was absolutely certain I was going to drown. Around 8 p.m., I decided to head to a bar hoping to meet up with some people, which in hindsight was way too early. Not seeing anyone I knew, I left, planning to return later. The sky was ominous, a clear sign of an approaching storm. Instead of sticking to the familiar streets, I made the foolish decision to take a trail that ran alongside the river, thinking it would be a shortcut to my apartment. I knew there was an access point from the trail. Of course, just a few minutes later, the heavens unleashed a downpour. I wasn't very familiar with the trail, so I just kept walking and occasionally running in what I thought was the direction of my place. Eventually, I found myself next to a zoo, which I knew for a fact was nowhere near my apartment. At this point, panic started to set in. I was new to the area, completely lost, and didn't have anyone with a car I could call for a ride. I started walking along the road, desperately searching for a bus stop, but inevitably, the bus zoomed past just before I could reach it. I kept walking, now in near full-blown panic. My family was 11 hours away. I'd only moved to this state a month or so prior and had absolutely no idea where I was. I walked and walked until, like a beacon in the storm, I stumbled upon a gas station. Relief washed over me. After asking the kind cashier for directions, it turned out I was closer to home than I had feared. I followed the road she indicated until I reached my street, and then just walked the rest of the way home. By then, the rain had mostly subsided, but I was still soaked to the bone. Finally reaching my apartment, I was overcome with relief. The next time I walked along that river trail, I discovered that I had completely missed the bridge that would have led me directly to my apartment complex. I mentally berated myself for my stupidity, kicking myself repeatedly for good measure. So, I suppose that whole ordeal constitutes the scariest and definitely the stupidest moment of my life. This was beyond foolish, dangerous, and I should have known better. People with mental illness should never, under any circumstances, experiment with drugs. But self-medication and bipolar disorder often go hand in hand, and this was long before I decided to quit drugs for good, before I had any real understanding of how to take care of myself. A while ago, I thought it would be a good idea to try a candy flip, taking MDMA and LSD together. I took a pretty hefty dose of MDMA and 3 blotters of very potent LSD. The experience started out fine, but a few hours in, I found myself trapped in an endless thought loop. I couldn't distinguish what was real and what wasn't. My mind was racing faster and faster in circles, and I was starting to panic. I believe the combination of those drugs triggered a manic episode or perhaps even a psychotic break. I was losing control, spiraling into an overwhelming state of confusion. I couldn't even manage basic things like hydrating myself or calming down with music, let alone reach out to someone for help. The details of what happened next are blurry, but what I remember felt disturbingly real. I vividly recall people barging into my room, violently beating me, knocking me to the ground, and slamming knives and axes into my body. I could feel my blood as if it were dripping from my own skin while demonic figures attacked me, sinking their teeth into me. All I could do was scream, utterly convinced that I was in hell. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed, hooked up to a catheter and tubes, with no memory of how I ended up there. I could only think, oh my God. At the time, I was living with my parents, and they later told me the nightmare that had unfolded. I had been screaming in a completely incoherent, made-up language, completely naked, smashing holes in the walls, knocking over the TV, tearing down the blinds, and destroying everything in sight. I even ripped the handles off of my drawers. In a panic, they called 911, and it took 4 officers to restrain me. I was told that I had nearly died from dehydration and the dangerously high dose of MDMA. My kidneys were on the brink of failure, and I almost required dialysis due to muscle breakdown and elevated enzyme levels. I was incredibly lucky. I was also fortunate that I wasn't sent to a mental institution after the episode. That experience completely changed my perspective and made me swear off drugs for good. I'm honestly ashamed that it took something so catastrophic to make me realize how reckless and stupid I had been. I debated not even sharing this story, but it serves as a lesson I needed to learn, and it's made me a much better person since. All right, I'm not here to debate whether or not ghosts exist. This is just a story from my life that I want to share, something that happened in one place on one night. Nothing more, nothing less. For some context, I'm a numbers guy. It's what I do for a living, and to me, things either add up or they don't. I'm a black and white person, and I'd like to think most people who know me would call me down to earth, probably a little skeptical by nature. I believe in science and facts. But, well, sometimes life throws a curveball. A very close friend of mine is about as grounded, trustworthy, and intelligent as they come. He's one of the most practical people I know. A few weeks after he moved into a new apartment, we met up for drinks. In the middle of our conversation, he casually mentions that he thinks his new basement apartment might be haunted. Naturally, I reacted with WTF, but he started telling me about the strange things going on there. Apparently, this one battery-powered clock would randomly have its hands move backward, rapidly, before returning to the correct time. The weird part? Even when the battery was removed, it still did this. But it didn't stop there. He also claimed that someone, or something, would rearrange his shoes. They'd be stacked on top of each other, slippers on top of dress, shoes on top of running shoes, and so on. This all happened when he was alone in the apartment. He said it occurred twice a day, usually when he left the room for less than 2 minutes. The apartment was always locked, and there were no windows big enough for anyone to squeeze through. This was a basement unit, after all. Now, I'm thinking he's messing with me, but he insists it's been happening every day for the past 3 weeks, and even gave the entity a name, Gertie. He said just felt right. And here's the kicker. He wasn't scared at all. He thought Gertie was just having a little fun with him. Bigger balls than I have, I'll tell you that much. A few weeks later, we're watching the hockey game at his place, and after a few minutes, I noticed the clock on the side table. I ask if this was the clock, and he confirms it. I ask him to remind me about the shoes, and he suddenly gets up, saying he doesn't feel well. He runs to the bathroom, and before I know it, He's puking violently. It was so bad that I had to go in and make sure he was okay. I ended up physically leading him to his bed, where he passed out almost instantly. We had just cracked open our first beers, so there was no other reason for this to be happening. I checked on him a few times. He was in a deep sleep, breathing normally, but it was unsettling. I briefly thought about calling an ambulance, but since he seemed fine and was just sleeping deeply, I decided to stay and keep an eye on him. I was planning to stay the night anyway, since my family was out of town and the landlord was away too. I finished the game, checked on him again, still out cold, and cracked open another beer. I admit, I was a little freaked out by the whole thing, especially after he'd mentioned Gertie earlier, but the clock seemed normal. Eventually, I dozed off on the couch. That's when I woke up to a deafening bang, so loud it felt like the walls were shaking. I jumped up and ran to check on my friend. He was still deep asleep, but the banging was getting closer, coming from the direction of the bathroom. The sound was violent and rapid, and I thought for sure someone in the neighboring house would hear it. I moved toward the bathroom, but as I got closer, I stopped dead in my tracks. The furnace, which was in the hallway leading to the bathroom, was glowing hot, bright red, like something out of Furnace Fireball. I've never seen anything like it. The noise and heat coming from it were so intense, I honestly thought the house might explode at any moment. I bolted back to my friend's bedroom, screaming at him to wake up. I shook him so hard, yelling at him to get up and get out now. It took a few seconds, but he finally started to stir. His first words? WEF. As soon as he said that, the banging stopped. Just like that, silence. I tried to explain to him what had happened, but when we went back to the furnace, it was completely normal, quiet, cold, and functioning like always. I asked how he was feeling, and he said he felt fine, better than fine, actually, and asked me what had happened earlier. I quickly explained everything, made sure he was okay, and then I left, getting out of there as fast as I could. I offered for him to come with me, but he wanted to stay. I didn't argue. I just got out of there in a hurry. A few weeks later, we talked about the incident. He joked that maybe Gertie had gotten jealous of me being there or upset that he'd told me about the strange happenings. He stayed in that apartment for another 2 or 3 years, but I only went there a handful of times, and I never spent another night there. So, feel free to rip this apart if you want. I'm sure you'll find a way to rationalize it. But as for me, this non-believer was definitely spooked that night. I have a few stories, some of which I'd explain as supernatural, but given the Reddit crowd, I'll skip the details for now. Here's one that's definitely not supernatural. I took a very high dose of mushrooms in tea form. It was my first time tripping, and clearly, we didn't quite nail the dosage. At first, everything was awesome. I felt connected to everything in the universe, like all the pieces of reality were falling into place. But then, my friend suggested we move, and once we were around more people, things got overwhelming. We found a little shelter behind some trees, but that didn't help at all. Soon enough, my thoughts went from just strange to absolutely horrifying. It felt like my mind was being tortured, like my thoughts were being assaulted in ways I can't even describe. It was too much, way too much. I thought I had gone unhinged and that I'd lost my mind forever. Then I started to think that because my thoughts were spiraling so high, I might just fall through some rift in the universe and disappear into nothingness. At one point, I convinced myself that everything and everyone around me was just a fabrication of my mind. It was terrifying. I've always had this deep fear of losing my sanity, and in that moment, it felt all too real. The following week, my girlfriend and some Pink Floyd helped me get back on track. But there was one song I couldn't bring myself to listen to: Echoes. The screeching part halfway through, with Gilmour's guitar wailing, reminded me too much of the chaotic sounds I was hearing in my head as I felt like I was losing control. I was in a car accident. I hit some debris in the fast lane, which caused me to spin 180 degrees and slide across the freeway, facing the wrong way. It was around 6 a.m., and all I could see were headlights and hear tires screeching. I was frozen, unable to even scream from the terror I felt. Somehow, I ended up on the right shoulder. I ended up breaking my L1 vertebra, but thankfully I healed up just fine. I'm torn between two incidents. The first time was when I was walking home from school and a van pulled up next to me. The door swung open and a couple of guys tried to pull me inside. Thankfully, my mom was right beside me and started yelling for me to run. She usually let me walk home alone, but that day she had picked up my little sister from the same school, so she was with me. The second time was kind of my own fault. I went sandboarding and decided to go beyond the allowed area, heading toward this massive cliff. I was going so fast, I actually thought that if I fell, I wouldn't want to survive. The idea of being a quadriplegic for the rest of my life, or suffering for hours before help arrived, terrified me. Looking back, it seemed a little dramatic, but at the time, I was genuinely scared. A few years ago, I was in Amsterdam for Tech Days or some other Microsoft event. I had recently heard a lot about how great it was to trip on shrooms, so I figured I'd give it a try. I went out alone, wandered around until I found a shop selling mushrooms, and asked a friendly young woman behind the counter for some guidance. She helped me pick something out, explaining that I should start with about a quarter of the box, then wait an hour. If nothing happened, I could eat another quarter. She also told me that if I didn't enjoy the experience, sugar, like candy or soda, would help take the effects away. So, I followed her instructions. I ate a quarter of the box and felt nothing. I ate another quarter and decided to walk around the red light district for a bit. I clearly remember a shady-looking guy brushing past me and whispering cocaine in a hoarse voice, but that was about it. Still, no effects from the mushrooms. At that point, I ate the rest of the box and started heading home. Once back at my place, I laid in bed, watched some TV, and eventually fell asleep. At some point, honestly, I have no idea how long later, I woke up in a full-blown panic. It was the worst feeling I've ever experienced. I wasn't scared of anything specific, just waves and waves of pure fear, overwhelming me to the point where I couldn't move. My eyes were darting everywhere, and I ended up raiding the minibar, eating all the chocolate and drinking all the mini sodas. None of it helped. I was so terrified I could barely breathe. After what felt like an eternity, I finally dozed off again. When I woke up the next day, I felt fine, just a bit tired. Needless to say, I've stayed away from shrooms ever since. Our family was in St. Louis visiting relatives for New Year's Eve. We were on our way to my grandmother's house to deliver a bucket of KFC, a pretty typical sixth grader's NY adventure with my father driving, my mother in the passenger seat, and my sister and I in the back of our Ford Escort wagon. But things were about to get drastically different. I heard a terrible screech of metal on metal, immediately followed by my mother's panicked voice saying something like, "He's going to hit us! He's going to hit us!" I saw a large red shape plummeting from the sky towards our small car, accompanied by a blinding shower of sparks. And then everything went black. I woke up to the sound of my mother's agonizing cries and utter chaos around me. My eyes were filled with blood, and though I couldn't feel anything, I knew instinctively that my forehead was split wide open. I looked at my sister and saw pure, unadulterated horror in her eyes. The entire right side of her head, from her eyebrow to the left of her hairline, was cracked open. I could see her skull, and she was just sitting there in shock. My mother, whose entire right leg from the knee down was trapped beneath the crushed front of the car, couldn't turn around to see her children. My father, who was relatively unharmed but clearly shaken, turned to us and said that help was on its way. I instinctively took off my flannel shirt and handed it to my sister, telling her to press it against her head. For some reason, that was the only thing I could think to do. The shock had numbed any pain I might have felt, and I was unable to move within a mangled car. As the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, my mother's screams mingled with the horrifying sight of my sister's exposed skull, adding to the terror of not knowing the extent of my own injuries. It took what felt like an eternity, about 7 minutes, for help to arrive, but those were undoubtedly the scariest 7 minutes of my life. We later learned that a massive 3-ton work truck traveling in the opposite lanes had experienced mechanical failure. The driver had radioed in about the trouble, but decided to try and make it back to base instead of stopping. The steering wheel began to lock up, and he lost complete control, crashing into the highway median at nearly full speed. The impact launched the truck into the air, sending it hurtling across the median and directly onto our little Ford Escort wagon. In a bizarre twist, my father was one of the people who helped pull the other driver from the wreckage of his truck after it had bounced off our car and back into the highway. The most terrifying moment was the 2 seconds I spent staring at the massive dump truck that the car I was a passenger in was about to T-bone at 55 miles per hour. The immediate aftermath of the collision was also incredibly frightening. There was blood everywhere, and I couldn't immediately identify all the places I was cut. A sharp, searing pain made me suspect my collarbone was broken. The side of the car I was on was completely crushed, and I had to scramble out the passenger side, a desperate urgency fueled by the fear that the dump truck's side-mounted gasoline tanks might ignite before I could escape the wreckage. When I was 8, I woke up to something warm on the back of my head at 3 a.m. Through the dim light, I saw a silhouette standing next to me, its arm reaching toward my pillow. It felt like someone was cradling my head. I screamed, a scream that echoed through the house. My mom rushed in, bursting through the door within seconds. I told her everything, but by the time she got there, the silhouette was gone, vanished. To this day, I swear what I saw and felt was real, but I can't explain how it disappeared. There's no logical reason for it. When I was 18, I was traveling in Mexico with a friend. We were on a bus, heading through the middle of nowhere, when out of nowhere, around 30 guys with massive guns stopped us. They stormed the bus, shouting at us in Spanish. We didn't speak the language and were completely terrified, young and alone in a foreign place. They ordered us off the bus along with the other passengers, and we stood on the side of the road while they tore through all the luggage, their guns aimed at us. After a tense while, they let us go, and we got back on the bus. When we finally reached our destination, we checked our bags. Nothing was missing, though, to be honest, we didn't have much they'd want. For all I know, they were searching for drugs, guns, or even fruit. But whatever their goal was, it was an experience that left us shaken. I was skiing in Colorado, taking a detour off the trail to ski through a river valley. The sky was overcast and the light was incredibly flat, making everything look the same. I had gone pretty far ahead of my group, so I stopped to wait for them. As I stood there, I took off my goggles to clear some snow, and that's when I saw it. Just 3 feet in front of me was a cliff. A sheer 100-foot drop onto exposed rock. Because of the flat light and lack of depth perception, I hadn't noticed it at all. I thought the trail just kept going down the valley. It was a mere 3 lucky feet that kept me from going over the edge. I had to hike back up the trail and out. Even now, thinking about it gives me a sick feeling. A few moments that still haunt me. Being in labor, the epidural wearing off, pushing through the excruciating pain, and then realizing there's no reverse button. It hit me. There's no turning back from this. Blacking out from standing up too quickly. I lose control of all my muscles, which start convulsing. Apparently this is common in the elderly, while my hand was stuck inside a heavy birdcage above my head. I crumpled, and the birdcage crashed down with me, smashing my head into a window frame. Instant concussion. I woke up convinced that all my family members were aliens who had taken over their bodies, and they were trying to mentally invade me. It was one of the strangest, scariest moments of my life. After 6 hours, 2 MRIs, and 800 milligrams ibuprofen, and thousands of dollars of medical bills, they told me I was fine, just no more head trauma anytime soon. The alien delusions eventually wore off. Mostly. Getting a call from my husband while I was at work, telling me my 5-month-old had fallen head first off a countertop of the babysitter's house while strapped into her bouncy chair. It was a 4-foot drop. 9 hours in the ER later, she was perfectly fine, but the cold chill that ran through me in that moment still haunts me. Waking up after a bad car accident and having to stare into the mirror to figure out if I was dead. My logic at the time was that if I couldn't see myself in the mirror, it meant I wasn't alive anymore. After gathering enough courage, I finally looked. And while I'm still here, I think. I've ridden off a few sport bikes, one of them more than once, had too many close calls to count, and even suffered a serious concussion. But strangely, the moment I came closest to literally crapping my pants was getting busted for underage drinking. My parents are amazing people, but total teetotalers, and they were strict about it. Still are, and I'm 30, having moved out when I was 20. I grew up in a tiny, remote town, and one night, my friend and I had just finished a couple of beers and were driving back into town. We came upon a couple of cars blocking a dirt road intersection. No big deal, we figured. We'd just drive into the ditch and go around them. They were probably doing the same thing we were. That was my thought, at least, until I saw the light rack on top of one of the vehicles. Then the spotlight clicked on, and I almost soiled myself. I was sitting in my computer, pretty much zoning out, when I heard some noise outside my window. I was sitting right in front of it, facing the glass. I turned down the music, and seconds later, I heard an ear-splitting crash as both of my windows were shattered by a garden pot, about 50 centimeters high. I got showered in glass and narrowly avoided being hit by the pot. As I looked outside, I caught a glimpse of an ex-friend before he quickly walked away. The reason he did it? A while back, there was an assault at a party I went to, and during a police interview, another former friend had falsely told the cops that I was involved in the beating. When they questioned me a second time, I told them the truth, that he was the one who did it. Apparently, that didn't sit well with him. That was around 8 months ago, and I'm still too scared to go back to the town where it happened. I've cut ties with all my friends since then. I was walking, lost in thought, when I crossed a Pelican crossing. I was pretty sure my light was green. A few meters later, it hit me. There was a Mercedes, probably doing about 60 kilometers per hour, that had passed me by no more than 20 centimeters. The driver slammed on the brakes, but strangely, I didn't even flinch. I just kept walking and thought, well, that would have been over quickly. Honestly, I didn't find it particularly scary. But if I ever look at it from someone else's perspective, which I think I will someday, I'd probably choose that moment as the one to remember. About 15 years ago, my family and I were staying at a Bible camp with a bunch of other families we knew. One night, all the adults went back to their tents and cabins, and the kids snuck out to hang out and have some fun. The camp's entrance was about half a mile from a quiet backwoods highway, which wasn't very busy, but was a main road leading into the nearest town. A few of us decided to go hang out by the road and cause a little mischief. Someone came up with the brilliant idea to play run to the line, meaning we would race to the double line in the middle of the road. As we were goofing off, we saw an 18-wheeler barreling down the road at around 60 to 65 miles per hour. Without thinking, we dared one of the group to run out in front of the truck. Of course, being young and stupid, he actually did it. I've never seen an 18-wheeler do this before or since, but the truck actually hopped. The driver slammed on the air brakes and emergency brakes while going full speed. It took him about a quarter mile to finally come to a stop, and when he did, he jumped out of the truck, yelling every curse word imaginable. I'm sure whatever he was hauling got wrecked, and his truck's braking system probably didn't survive either. We all bolted and ran back to the camp, sneaking back into our tents and cabins. Just then, we heard sirens blaring down the road, heading in our direction. I still remember the police searchlights shining through the fabric of my tent as they tried to figure out who was responsible. The next day, we all met up to see if anyone had been caught or if anything had happened. Apparently, the camp staff had been called out by the police in the middle of the night to question everyone, but no one said a word. As far as I know, nobody was ever caught. To this day, whenever I'm near a big truck, I can't help but think of the sparks flying out from that truck as it tried to stop. This might seem pretty tame compared to some of the stories here, but it's been one of the most terrifying experiences I've had. I'm currently on a course of Accutane, a really strong acne medication. Thanks, Dad, for those backache genes. It's known to sometimes cause psychological side effects, though I've never experienced the severe depression that people warn about. However, I've recently gone through a few strange and terrifying experiences while on it. So far, I've had sleep paralysis 3 times since starting the medication. I'm not entirely sure the Accutane is to blame, but I've never had it happen before I started taking it. Each time, I experience the same hallucination. I'm awake, but completely unable to move. I start hearing faint whispering in my ears, and I try to move, but I can't. The fear inside me grows with each passing second. The whispering becomes clearer, turning into an incomprehensible jumble of voices speaking in a strange language or just gibberish. Then the voices shift to screaming, still totally unintelligible. Finally, it's just static. This cycle repeats at least once more. During all of this, as my fear peaks, I try to scream for help, but I can't. Hands down, this has been the scariest recurring experience of my life. My boyfriend and I were in Japan, and we decided to climb Fuji. We didn't expect it to take most of the day, but it did. Our plan was to start at the bottom and climb all the way up on the Yashitaguchi Trail, which is the oldest route to the summit. This trail has 10 stations along it, which are essentially mountain huts. In the busy season, these huts offer food, water, and accommodation. However, we were climbing in the off-season, so we were planning to stay overnight at the 5th station, halfway up, and finish the rest of the climb in the morning. It was hot and humid when we arrived at the base of the mountain around 3 or 4 p.m. Our last meal had been at 11 a.m. We were both carrying backpacks and wearing Chuck Taylors. Great climbing shoes, right? We thought the trail would be manageable, and we were expecting a noodle house open about an hour into the hike where we could get food and water. When we arrived at the noodle house, it was closed. Great. No big deal, we thought. We could still handle it. It was only supposed to be about a 2-hour hike, right? We kept going. The trail was narrow, dirt with rocks scattered about, and we walked through forest with tall grass around us. We saw a deer, and I freaked out when I almost stepped on a frog. I thought it was a snake. As the day turned to night, the trail began to steepen. We almost went the wrong way, but managed to stay on the right path. There was no one around, just the eerie silence of the forest. Thankfully, we had headlamps, but we were both thirsty and starting to get worried about the increasing darkness. By the time it was fully dark, we were exhausted and cold. We were sweating, but freezing at the same time. We passed a few shrines along the trail, which felt creepy in the dark. The trail turned into steep hills with large rocks. At the base of each hill, there were pits filled with stones that we either had to navigate around or cross on a wooden plank. Then we started seeing the stations. These weren't the functional huts we were expecting. These were dilapidated buildings, falling apart with rubble everywhere. It was unnerving, stumbling across these crumbling structures in the pitch black. It looked like something out of a horror movie. We started to panic, wondering if we were on the wrong trail. We felt so isolated. No one was around, and we feared what would happen if we didn't make it to the 5th station. We trudged on, a storm beginning to roll in. The trail was completely black, and I kept turning my headlamp on and off to see just how dark it was. Why did I do that? It was terrifying. Every 100 meters or so, we collapsed, too exhausted to keep going, but too scared to stop for long. We took turns freaking out. One of us would cry, and the other would try to comfort them. We heard some music coming from the distance, probably from the road that leads up to the 5th station. But we were too scared to leave the trail, so we called for help, but no one answered. We passed the 4th station, and the 5th couldn't be too much further, right? But when we came across another building, we were shocked. This was the 5th station. It was locked, dark, and deserted. We knocked on the door, but no one answered. The storm was getting louder, and we were completely desperate. At this point, we decided to continue on, and if nothing else, sleep outside in our sleeping bags near the last hut. Then we found a sign with another trail map. It showed another road leading off to the right, and there was another number 5 on it. That gave us a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was a false 5th station, and the real one was still ahead. We collapsed again, too thirsty and exhausted to think straight. My boyfriend wanted to turn back and sleep on the ground near the last hut. I kept reminding him about the sign, urging him to trust that there was another station. We finally rounded a corner and saw the trail disappear through some bushes. When we climbed through, we found ourselves on a paved road. We were beyond relieved. There were lights up ahead. We followed the road and eventually found some stairs leading up to a building. We collapsed just a few meters away from it before pushing ourselves to get up. We found a toilet block near the building, and desperate, we drank water straight from the sink, which we later found out was not safe. We continued on, stumbling into another building where we saw a girl inside. She came out, and with our limited Japanese, my boyfriend asked if we could sleep there. She said yes, and we scrambled inside, throwing our gear on the floor and asking for food and water. I was shaking by then, craving sugar more than anything. The first thing I had was a can of Coke and a Snickers bar. It was the best thing I've ever tasted. We were given dinner, and they even gave us extra food, probably out of pity considering how awful we looked. We collapsed into the bedding they provided, completely drained. The next morning, we were still too tired to climb to the summit. Instead, we walked to where the buses arrived, something we'd seen on the sign at the false 5th station, and caught a long, miserable ride back to Tokyo. That was hands down the worst, most terrifying experience of my life. And it was definitely the longest night I've ever had. Sorry for the long story, but it was a night I'll never forget. A few years ago, a kid invited me and my friend to a birthday party in the garden of their new house. We decided to check out the house and wandered inside. We ended up in a small room beneath the stairs, just as curiosity led us there. Out of nowhere, the doors slammed shut behind us, and the handle slipped on the other side, locking us in the tiny, pitch-black room. I was absolutely terrified. Thankfully, the kid's younger brother came to the rescue, fixing the handle and letting us out. We were safe, but I won't forget how scared I felt in that dark little space. When I was around 18, I worked in a machine shop. One day, the hydraulics on a forklift failed, sending 2,500 pounds of steel barreling toward me. I had just a split second to turn and run before the impact. Then, everything went black. The next thing I remember, I was half conscious, dragging myself away from the wreckage on my hands and knees. I ended up with a broken ankle, a deep gash in my arm, and a concussion, but it could have been so much worse. The steel actually hit me on the head and knocked me out of the way instead of crushing me. If I'd been even a fraction of a second slower, the angle would have been different and I wouldn't be here. If the metal had hit me on top of my head instead of the back, I'd have been crushed. I literally escaped death by less than an inch. Every time I think about it, it's the scariest thing I can imagine. I guess someone was looking out for me that day. I was driving through Nova Scotia on a snowy day, but the roads were surprisingly clear. At one point, I was on a long incline on a divided highway and decided to pass an 18-wheeler. Unbeknownst to me, the county boundary shifted halfway up that hill, which also meant a change in the plow operator responsible for each county. It's a seriously flawed policy to have these plowing zones change at such critical points, as road conditions can change drastically and without warning. Right there, halfway up the incline, as I was passing the 18-wheeler, the clear road suddenly turned to treacherous slush. My van lost all traction, and I started spinning wildly. In that moment, a terrifying certainty washed over me. I was going to die. My thoughts instantly flashed to my 4 kids, whom I was driving to visit. I was overwhelmed by the thought of how much I would miss them and the devastating loss they would endure. Miraculously, my van spun around, somehow avoiding the massive 18-wheeler, and slid backward into a guard railing. It was almost a gentle stop, considering I'd been traveling at 60 miles per hour. I have to give credit to GM. The Pontiac Montana truly absorbed the entire impact. The van was a complete write-off, but I walked away without a scratch. The next time I saw my kids, I held them in extra long, tight hugs. Since then, I've read that others have tragically died on that same stretch of road, and I can't help but worry that it was due to the same sudden and dangerous change in road conditions I experienced. I contacted the Department of Transportation to inform them about the hazardous plowing situation on that particular incline, Mount Tom, but I never received a response. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and we will see you in the next video.